welcome to the Dial Global Virtual Lounge. This is the show where we discuss the future of the modern workplace and the impact of diversity, inclusion and belonging with the world's most successful and innovative business leaders. Today, we've got a fantastic panel lineup for you, and we're joined by four exceptional individuals, including Andy Goss, Chairman of the Board at Vertu Motors PLC, Katherine Bennet, CBE, Senior Vice President at Airbus, Andrew Denton, CEO of Alpha Financial, and Nick Smith, Partner in the automotive and technology sectors for Deloitte Consulting. Welcome to the show, all. So today we're going to be talking around a whole plethora of different subjects around diversity and inclusion, and also the impact and unknowns surrounding COVID-19 and what the future looks like ultimately when it comes to not only leading and managing in uncertain times, but also what we're experiencing in specific within the automotive and manufacturing arenas. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of the conversation, I wonder, by way of a brief round robin and introduction for those listeners who perhaps don't know you all as well as I do, whether we could all give a brief intro, who we are, and some of the pieces that we are doing at the moment. And Andy, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
So I'm Andy Goss, Chairman of Vertu Motors. I've worked in the auto industry for about 40 years, past 28 in C-suite roles with some organisations such as Toyota, Porsche and Jaguar Land Rover, initially in North America as president there, and then main board position looking after sales and service from a global perspective, and have been Vertu now for a couple of years. So, and you're right, this is very interesting and very challenging times for all of us, so that there's no doubt.
Many thanks, Andy. And just move back round on my screen. So we said, so Katherine.
Oh, hi there. Thank you for the invitation. I was just thinking whether I've got any connections with any of the other people on the panel today, and I have slight ones. One is that I did work in automotive myself several years ago. I worked at GM for nearly 9 years, and I'm working with Deloitte at the moment on a project because I have the honour of chairing the newest UK powerhouse called Western Gateway. So we're working with Deloitte on that. But Andrew, I don't think I've got any connection with Alpha. I'm sorry, but maybe in the future.
That's okay. You're excused. When I explain, maybe you'll figure some.
So yeah, I've been at Airbus for 16 years. I'm the most senior executive here in the UK, reporting directly to the global CEO. So I'm the main external facing person for the company, dealing with government relations and media. And I work extremely closely, of course, with the people who run our factories around various sites here in the UK.
Many thanks. And Andrew.
Yep, Andrew Denton again. Thank you for the invite. I'm Chief Exec of Alpha Financial Software. Very different biography to Andy's, which is that I've been at the same place for 25 years and done just about everything at Alpha. We provide really big, heavy lifting software for the asset finance industry. So, Katherine, I've got a big connection with you because an awful lot of Airbus aircraft go through our software at the big ticket end of the range, and an awful lot of autos go through our software at the smaller consumer end of the range. If anybody remembers the spiel that Hansen used to put out on the TV about a company over here doing very well over there.
Yes.
That's kind of us. We have very, very little sterling income these days, so I feel like I run a US company, and as Andy said, challenging times. My experience will be probably slightly different to yours because as a tech, we have no physical supply chain, and we're obviously very well able to work remotely, but it's not without its issues, as you can imagine.
Many thanks. And finally, Nick.
Yes, hi, Nick Smith here. I'm partner in Deloitte's consulting business in the UK. I look after our consulting work in the automotive and auto finance sectors. Been at Deloitte 14 years. Previous to that, worked for IBM at a number of years. So really a lot of my background has been in helping clients with technology-enabled change programs. I think I've got some connection, or at least secondary connection to everyone. So Andrew, Denton, I think we've met a number of times, and obviously at conferences and the like, and know your product reasonably well from the market I work in. And Katherine, as you talked about, great you're working with some of our colleagues. And then Andy, I think you've worked with colleagues of mine over the years at various different organisations. So great to be on the panel. Thank you for the opportunity. And similar to Andrew, Denton, in some ways it's quite a different for us at this point in time. We don't have that physical supply chain in the same way. A lot of our supply chain is our people. So we've had obviously a lot of work to do in moving 20,000 people to remote working, but we're sort of seeing both sides in terms of the change for our business, in terms of all the clients we serve and how we're having to react differently to a different set of challenges and ways of working.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for sharing some insight into what's going on at the moment. And we've all mentioned there, obviously, we are living in these unprecedented times that none of us have, thankfully, I say, lived through at any point before. But clearly, when it comes to manufacturing, automotive, industries, there's a lot by way of physical supply chain and serious changes and adaptations that need to be made. I wonder from your perspectives, if we're to look at all of our respective sectors, which loosely are in similar or connected industries, what are some of the key challenges that we are finding in terms of planning now out of this exit strategy, whilst there is no crystal ball, and certainly can we say whether it will be V-shaped, will it be L-shaped? We don't know. What are some of the observations and some of the plans that we are starting to put in place, respectively?
For us, we endeavoured actually not to shut down our factories. We're very much part of a European production network, so we had to sort of work closely with our European other sites in terms of not ensuring that aircraft continue to be made, but obviously then there came a point where, looking at aviation at the moment, it's a very, very serious situation. So we've had to slow down and reduce our production rates. An interesting time in terms of dealing with employees and communicating with them about best things, safe practices at work. And I'm very proud of the work that our company has done. Our big manufacturing facility is up in North Wales, near Chester, where we build the wings of every Airbus aircraft. And we've had to bring in, obviously, all the right social distancing measures and proper health and safety directions and signage, etc. And the other big thing we've done is work really, really closely with our trade unions on what the art of the possible is when you're building an aircraft wing, which I know is a slightly bigger thing than a car. So I can see why different parts of manufacturing had to adapt differently.
Many thanks, Katherine. Andy?
Yeah, picking up some of those issues, I agree. One of the principal issues to start with, and this goes in phases, I think, was around the whole employment and customer part. So, phase one almost was closing down the business. We've got 133 retail sites, we've got 6,000 people. And of course, closing down is never so straightforward. And then there's probably a bit of a false start in a way, because we didn't totally close down. We kept workshops open, about 98 sites for essential workers from a service perspective. And then I think, like most organisations, we then went through the cash flow management aspect of this, which is absolutely crucial, and is got to be a remaining issue, I think, for some time to come, really. And of course, now we're in the stage of understanding what reopening looks like, which looks as though it could be, fingers crossed, June 1st. Obviously, the workshops are now more open than ever before, but opening the showrooms is critical. And that needs to happen, because car manufacturing can't take place if the retailer's not moving the stock. And to a large degree, there's a lot of stock out there already before we start on a normal cycle of business, if you like. It's been the phase that we're in terms of reopening now is clearly interesting and challenging. That now that we've got our brain around the fact there's £350,000 of the PPE which we need to budget for every single month. That was a key factor. And I suppose for me, out of all this, all the things that were going to happen in the auto industry will still happen. I think some of them will accelerate. I think one or two things won't happen. I think car sharing you now put on the back burner for some time to come. But being realistic, certainly in the retail sector, it's quite feasible over a period of time now that 30% of those sites that existed before will not be there in, let's say, 12, 24 months' time. And for the organisations that are left, and we went into this with no debt whatsoever, we have to make the most of the opportunities rather than just the risks that come out of this particular catastrophe that we've all dealt with, actually. So, there's a lot to be done still, I think, actually, from my perspective, getting the governance between the board and the the exec team has been critical of that, thankfully. I think we've kept all 6,000 people on board with a phenomenal communication strategy, which has been a key ingredient of success, I think. But long way to go yet, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's very insightful indeed, Andy. And I'd actually love to come on to governance and board and inclusion actually related to that in just a while. So we'll pick that piece up there very shortly, if that's okay. And Andrew, in terms of, and I know, obviously you have mentioned there that there is no necessary kind of supply chain, and you're coming at this from a slightly different angle. But a lot of your big customers are, albeit banks or automotive and leasing, financing, etc. What are you hearing from the market at the moment with the customers? Is this impacting significantly, or what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an interesting situation. I mean, we should have a pretty strong word with ourselves as a tech if we can't move to a remote working paradigm pretty seamlessly. So I sent 330 odd people home on the 12th, and that's where we've been ever since. There are two halves of our business. One half is making the software, and there's another half that looks probably a bit like Nick's business, which is doing stuff alongside the customers. And I think what it's done from a particular services perspective is it's accelerated something that was already slightly happening. Having people on site working alongside you is desirable, but it's expensive. So there was already a move to collaborative tools and so on to work with the customers. I think we're kind of lucky because the software that we provide is very much the heart and lungs of what the customer does. So nothing has let up, but the big changes that we've really seen are in making sure that we can be responsive to our customers, particularly the consumer-facing customers in responding to theirs. So one of our US customers has got close on 5 million vehicles under finance, so had to process about 500,000 vehicles one Saturday just for forbearance requirements. And we need to make sure that we're there to assist them and make sure that the software now more than ever is able to do what they need to do. I'd say the same as Andy in terms of the shape of the industry. I mean, probably around half of our income, one way or another, comes from automotive finance. Car sharing has disappeared, but the thing I've been banging on about for a while, the idea of digital Darwinism, and you've got to be able to work in that way. That seems to be really accelerating mobility type products, flexible payment type products. I think when this all dies down, it will be a very interesting and different automotive and equipment finance industry, but it will still be there. People still need stuff.
Indeed, I concur with the Darwinism comment there as well. It's an evolution that has certainly been expedited far beyond I think any of us could have imagined. And your thoughts, Nick, as well, from obviously a consulting point of view, working across the board, probably with many customers, which obviously I won't ask you to mention, but for confidentiality purposes, but broad brush speaking.
Well, I guess I could probably there's two sides of this for us. One's the inward facing into our business and the impact there, where similar to what Andy Denton described about their services business. Actually, the move to we moved 20,000 people to remote working almost overnight. Great ability to do that and great credibility to our IT team in enabling that to happen. But actually, that's been fairly natural because we're used to working in ways. We're used to working in global teams. We're used to working with offshore development centres, so that's quite a natural way of working for many of our people looking in. So then we're to then turn quite quickly towards actions we need to take in our business in terms of resilience of that business, where in professional services we tend to sort of lag the economy by a few months in terms of our business and had to do some scenario planning pretty early on to ascertain what that means, but then maintain a very kind of clear, calm, consistent communication strategy with people, all of our people, about what this means and the actions we're thinking of taking. And I think we're really proud of actually the way our executive team have handled that and really set and communicated a guiding set of principles around which they will make those decisions, and being very transparent in the actions being taken, and then sort of facing out into the market and the automotive clients I work with, very, very reflective of both the Andy's made really in terms of the business and the impact there. And I really do see an acceleration of certain initiatives, particularly around that digital engagement with customers, both in the sales and kind of service cycle. And then interestingly, seeing now, I think we can as this kind of moves east to west, there's a lot we can learn from the Chinese market and others. Talking to some of my colleagues over there relatively recently, you know, they were quite quickly back up to full manufacturing capacity in China, and have actually seen a bounce in April. So actually this April saw slightly bigger sales than a year ago, which is sort of reflective of a bounce and potentially some pent-up demand. They've certainly seen greater impact of that digital engagement, and actually, you know, reflecting the points on kind of shared mobility. There's this kind of M-shaped economy in China, and they've really seen in the kind of smaller car end of the market a real increase in demand as people are looking for personal mobility and this kind of new norm of avoiding public transport, which and I could see that starting to come into the European market as we start to come out the back of this as well.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting juxtaposition, I think, in terms of which way people will go. And certainly you can see it'll absolutely rise up one side because people are wanting individual modes of transport. But at the same time, what will it look like in terms of confidence, people actually getting out there, and how long will it take? You know, there's lots and lots of question marks. But one thing that you all mentioned there in your insights was the importance of, ultimately people and communications. And drawing upon something you started off with there, Andy, about the importance of governance at this point in time. And obviously, being in the chairman position, I'm sure there's lots of individuals there to be balancing up, lots of different stakeholders, and really, arguably, of course, I am slightly biased here, inclusivity, perhaps one of those absolute core essentials that is required more now than ever before. I wondered your take when it comes to not only, inclusivity within the boardroom and some of these important pieces that leaders need to consider at this point in time, but perhaps some of the lessons learned from having or being inclusive. Because, if I am to be, relatively kind of crude about it, the automotive industry perhaps hasn't been deemed maybe as the most diverse and inclusive. And, to a degree, I'd say same for a lot of the other kind of manufacturing sectors.
A huge part of getting through this has been the constant communication with the whole team, and in our case 5,900 people, of which 5,100 were furloughed. The fact you're furloughed doesn't mean you're not involved anymore. It means you're not working, but there's a huge degree of anxiety out there about what happens next. And I've got to say that we've got an extremely capable, extremely bright, extremely driven CEO, and he has constantly, and I mean every other day, been sending information to the whole of the workforce, working or not working. I think also led from the front in terms of the fact that the board, the execs and the non-execs took a 30% salary cut. We put the major execs in the organisation, they took a 20% salary cut in addition to that. So that for those who were furloughed, they didn't see an inconsistent approach. Everybody took part of the pain, but the communication thing has been critical, really. And I think for me, another key ingredient of success is that none of us have been through this before. We've been through recessions, but this is very different than a normal recession. And at board level, I mean, there's 7 of us involved at board level, 4 guys, 3 ladies, and we've got a fantastic CFO, also head of legal, and an incredible non-exec director. And the CEO really has relied upon the broad skills at board level to help him operationalize some of the things, and we have used our own expertise to help him make sure that he navigates through what has been, and still is, an extremely difficult period. No matter how bright you are, you've got to rely on the whole team. What we don't want out of this is some sort of Soviet command and control methodology. That would not work. You've got to get people inside the boat, rowing in the right direction. I say there's still a long way to go yet, actually, but I think so far so good in terms of keeping people on board. And then, of course, as a consequence of that, you've got a much better chance of keeping customers on board. And now, of course, as we start to open up, I think that communication and the way that people have seen transparency in the business should serve as well, really.
Very, very interesting indeed, and I couldn't agree more when it comes to that consistent communication. Ultimately, you've got a great split there. I know we're only mentioning one part, with it being gender, because ultimately we're looking for diversity of mindsets. But it's great to have that split, because it hasn't. If I look more holistically at maybe some of the automotive businesses, it certainly is a long shot off where you've just mentioned. Katherine, how are you finding things at Airbus? I'll pass over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to what Andy was saying. I mean, the key thing for me is company values. And despite the crisis you're in, the values that you hold as an individual and as a business person, an employer of people responsible for contributing to the nation's economy, let's hope that the values remain. I had a colleague I was talking to the other day. We were talking about sustainability and green transportation. See a big thing in automotive and aerospace, and he said, we have to, whatever happens, whatever the way we come out of this, we have to make sure we continue to be sustainable, efficient and competitive, but all of that has to be underpinned by the values that we hold dear. So diversity of gender, of course, is part of that, as you just said, in terms of thought processes and inputs, and in the decisions we've had to make, some of which have been very difficult. When you have employees, loved ones at home questioning why employees are having to go to work still when the Prime Minister says stay at home, and you're still trying to run a business, it gets very, very difficult. And you really have to work closely, communicate, as Andy talked about, regularly, be transparent, follow the guidance, work with the trade unions. There've been some, I'll be honest with you, there's been some very tricky things, use of social media, attacking businesses. We went through a period quite soon after the lockdown when businesses were being vilified somewhat, especially those of us who tried to keep open. But I think we've got through that, and maybe one of the ways we've got through that, and I don't know how the rest of you feel, but I've noticed a real warmth amongst people, whether it's my next door neighbour yesterday suddenly knocked on the door. She dropped off 2 face masks that she'd made for myself and my husband, an incredible kind of community values. And I do hope that some of that can be remembered whenever we move on to the next crisis. And of course, in my business, we're working closely with the airlines and the airline community and trying to get people flying again. And of course, we have to be courteous and respectful to people's views about whether they wish to get into an aircraft again, or get into a train again, or get into a tube train again. There's all those dimensions that I think does ensure a respect for diversity and consideration of people's opinions is all important. But of course, under all of that is the need to observe cash and continue to have a business that will continue to employ people and enable us to contribute to the nation's economy.
Very well said indeed. And I think you bring up such an important point there is, look, being absolutely transparent where you can. And I think a lot of the fear that I'm hearing from the market with execs is the piece there that you mentioned about being vilified. People are to a degree quite scared because it's certainly in environments like this when anxiety and stress is incredibly high, that one piece of communication from our leader, from our CEO, from one of the board, that the ripple effect that something like that can have, if it is, or the manner in which it can be taken, is often can be perceived in very different ways if we are not careful. But like you say, I think it's that in a way there's no point putting a load of gloss over this and hoping that it will be okay. All we can do at this point is be honest. There is bad news, there is furloughing going on, but ultimately trying to include those, as Andy said before, who have been furloughed, still keep them in the conversation, be it through the wonders of digital media, and to a degree it's also brings some more humanity in a very different way. You can see Andrew's dog there in the background, and it kind of it does make you feel that you've got a window into the world of someone else's life, and perhaps closer in a peculiar way. So to that, I'll come to you, Andrew, if that's okay. You and your lovely dog in the background.
Yeah, she's going to miss me. It's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? I hear a lot of themes that I completely agree with what Katherine said about being clear with the people that we work with colleagues. Actually, the best way that we can be true to our values and look after you as a workforce is keep the business going. I think we've been very fortunate so far, but people need to be clear about what the priorities are. But you do that stuff within your values. And again, I buy into that very heavily. And very much from the get-go, we told the organisation that we will be communicating frequently but imperfectly, and they have to understand that all we're doing is we're going to tell you absolutely everything that we feel we can, but that means you can expect us with good heart and integrity to say something that might perhaps contradict it, because there's a lot of difficulty in terms of the information around. I think in terms of looking after people, we might have different challenges, but to an extent I can empathise with Andy's point about making sure that everybody feels included. And I think the whole idea of inclusion has turned on its head a little bit, because there are more people who can feel excluded because they are working from home. And I think we as employers have got a duty to make sure that nobody is left behind, that everybody's included, that everybody's attending. We do a social breakfast every morning for those that want to come along. We just look at each other as we eat our cornflakes and discuss what we did the evening before. But who's not going along to those things? Who's not making use of those opportunities? Is there, I guess, particularly for us, we bring a load of graduates. So of the 60 graduates that we brought on last year, who is living on their own and not communicating and not feeling included in that way? Mental health, of course, is a massively important point. And I guess up until now, I think a lot of people, I'd like to say I don't, but I think a lot of people have thought about inclusion very much along battle lines of inclusion characteristics. And I think this is now a chance for us to see inclusion and exclusion a very different way as we come out of COVID.
Indeed, and you mentioned there about graduates. It's very, very interesting time of which I wonder to the future leaders, how they will look back and perceive this in a number of years' time. But certainly, these are digital natives that have grown up with tech. Almost youngsters holding iPads and whatnot. It's you see babies doing this and think, oh my goodness, I just can't believe they can do that. Already practically holding iPads as they're kind of one year old. It's just absolutely mad. But I think it does certainly highlight something within the the intergenerations, and those who perhaps weren't so used to using tech. Now everyone is it's almost an equal playing field on the world of digital and tech, really. But you all mentioned values there, and certainly values, culture, businesses that genuinely really care. I think, without sounding too fluffy here, will be the ones that win. Be the ones that are not swept out with the tide, because there's what the vast majority of the workforce now is millennials, and so they are known for, I guess, being outspoken and for sticking to core values and such like, but they demand to work for organizations that care and that really are living their values and not just playing lip service to them. This wonder of social media and such like, you can say literally whatever you want, and so I think it does become far harder to put up the facade of values if they don't actually exist at the board and are being carried out throughout the organisation. Which, and again, I wonder, Nick, your kind of take on things here. Before I ask, really, how important is it at this point in time, given that you're all very senior, seasoned leaders? How important is it to have a diverse and inclusive boardroom?
Well, if I come in on your last point, I think everybody talked about values there, and you did, and I think there's been a lot of talk over years about being purpose-led and organisations having a purpose, and I think now actually people are looking to their leaders to really demonstrate that and demonstrate how decisions are being made in line with that purpose. We've very early, as I think I mentioned earlier, set out some principles by which we'd make decisions. We were very clear in communicating those and being very clear, making sure those decisions were consistent with our purpose, our values, and being a responsible business. And this is fundamentally a human kind of crisis we're in, and that kind of empathy and compassion for the human side of things is really important. There's a lot of upheaval for people. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's that kind of change in focus from work to suddenly thinking about family safety, about health, about education, and all of these things. And I think the more we can be very clear and transparent on the decisions we're making and our expectations of our people, and taking some of those uncertainties away, the better. And completely agree with Andrew's point about communicating often and sometimes imperfectly, but just being transparent about that. It's about what you know at that point in time. We've got We run engagement surveys actually, and recently we've seen a real uptick in terms of people feeling engaged and communicating through that. Some of the feedback is that we might be doing too much. There's all the different groups and kind of cross sections of populations in the business, and the various breakfast sessions and check-ins that people have the opportunity to join, and possibly we're doing too much. But I think it's better to do too much. But I would pick up on the point that, you know, those are there for people to engage in if they choose to. It's actually the people you're missing from those who haven't joined for a given reason that we're very proactively wanting to follow up and make sure people are okay. And it's the human side of are you okay, particularly where there's not the sort of structure and social interaction of days in the office, where it can bring mental health problems, really to the fore, and trying to identify those challenges early is really important.
Many thanks, Nick. That's very insightful indeed. And Andy, I'm going to come to you again if that's okay. And I asked the question, I posed the question to everyone before we kind of run out of time, and I have a question actually for each of you as well. But very quickly, you have managed to create what is, with the CEO that you mentioned, a diverse board in a number of different ways. And when we look at the auto industry and some of the manufacturing industries, you want to give them a shake, or I want to give them a shake sometimes and say, look, where's the diversity and inclusion? And I worry sometimes when I look at some of the more archaic industries that they aren't coming to the forefront as much as your organisation has, and kind of pivoting with the times. How important an agenda would you say, honestly, is diversity and inclusion and belonging within the automotive industry, and what can organizations do to try and improve that? I know it's a big question, but again, the same question to all around and about that theme of D&I and B within the boardroom context, because ultimately you are all leaders and essentially role models and real models to others.
I think the truth of the matter is it's got a long way to go, and I think one of the resounding thoughts out of what we have been and what we are still going through at the moment is the importance of trust. Trust at every level with every single individual, and valuing them as an individual as well as part of a team. And I think the fact that if you've got almost a cloning of an organisation whereby I said before, Soviet style of, I won't mention who I'm thinking of specifically, but I can guess. who've operated in the wrong way there. I think, I would hope that people open their eyes through this particular period, and actually, as mentioned before, that the values comment is so important. Some organisations have got a proper set of values and are living it through this very, very difficult period. Others that just put the slogan on the wall, but still operate with an extreme example of a blame culture, I think will come a cropper, quite frankly. And we also need to be realistic about the fact that as bad as things have been since March, they're not going to get any better economically moving forward. It's going to get a lot harder. So all the legwork that's going in now in terms of communication, in terms of inclusion, in terms of getting everybody on board, needs to last for some particular period of time, because from a cost perspective, things are going to get very tough. And we saw from Rishi in the past, well, today actually, didn't we? The fact that there's an inevitability now of tax increases. Market sizes will get smaller, disposable income will get smaller. And probably, we need to keep everybody on side and on board in a very, very difficult situation moving forward. The best chance of doing that is by creating trust, and therefore creating a pride in the organisation that you work for every single person that's there. People that are failing to do that, as I say, I think will rue the day, to be honest with you. The tough times have yet to come. I think, we're now into the period of the economic issues versus the medical issues are becoming more prevalent. And all this money, this 300 billion, has got to be paid back. And that means from us, all of us, really. So I think we're in for some big tests moving forward, and proper leadership, and I say trust and values, as has been mentioned before, will be key as a key ingredient of success in getting through this particular situation.
Indeed, I think trust absolutely must be at the core and centre of every boardroom, frankly. Thoughts from anyone else? Katherine?
So I was thinking about your question. I mean, I don't know if any of you saw the news last night and the press conference that the President of the United States did when a lady journalist asked him a question and he said, "You need to go and ask China." And I was like hurrahing, cheering so loudly that she challenged him, because she nearly didn't. I could see how difficult it was for her to challenge him. And, you know, that behaviour was absolutely, you know, unquestionably bad, the way he responded. And for me, you know, she was a role model in the fact that she spoke up. And you could see all the other journalists completely supported her as well. And for me, that's just a good example of something I always say to people when they ask my advice about getting on in business is, you know, and we need men and women to do this, is call out bad behaviour. And all I would say is, working in this virtual world, you talked earlier about millennials and how, you know, they're used to sort of working digitally. One of the things I've heard talked about in the news over the last few weeks is how actually maybe women are coming to the fore a bit, because they are quite good at, you know, maybe there's different ways of working, and maybe women are used to working by themselves a bit more, but also keeping networks going. But men are good at that too as well, I know. But I think there's a whole, I've certainly been watching with great interest how my team has interacted with each other. And there's certain people in the team that have called these sort of Zoom pub quizzes, and there's a group of people in my team who have a cup of tea at 4 o'clock on Zoom. And actually, you know, it's keeping that going. The other thing that's worth talking about is, yes, we've all managed our meetings, etc. But it's when you don't know the people, like those of you on the call today. I don't know any of you. That's when it's difficult sometimes to get the business done, because you realise actually you do need the personal interaction to get things moving. You can do a certain amount of things, but thank goodness that you know that we can do these virtual meetings. But that's when you realise you miss the chats on the sidelines of the meetings, which is when the real trust develops that Andy talked about. So just a few observations from me on that question.
Very interesting indeed. And you know, Andrew, what are your thoughts there? You know, I know you mentioned before working with a lot of graduates and such like. And again, you know, some very relevant points there from what you said, Katherine. And I guess based on that, you know, are there almost being slight breakdowns in terms of hierarchies because of the fact that we are now, you know, on Zoom or Teams or whatever it might be?
I think I concur with a lot of the things that Andy said, and you know, you referenced a couple of times, Andy, the classic Prussian army command and control. I think good leaders are leaders who see themselves as leaders of other leaders, and I think that's where we are now. More than ever now, we're succeeding because our people are doing the right thing, acting within the values that they're very aware of. And I think it's been a theme of this panel actually, is that whatever you did before, if you did it at a superficial level, it will just not get you through. If your values, your principles, your ethos is heartfelt and ingrained, I can go under a bus tomorrow. I know that Alpha's values don't rest in me; they rest with Alpha, and I think that's the important thing. So that's probably the principal comment I've got is that you really are now seeing, I suppose in a funny old way, the opportunity to see all of the hard graft you've put in, all of the integrity that you've put into every interaction over the preceding years, and good organisations are seeing payoff for that.
Thank you very much, Andy. And Nick, I hear through the grapevine, actually, and I'm sure this will make Katherine smile, is you have a consortium called Women at the Wheel in Deloitte. I've been nudged to make sure that I bring this up today, and so thought I'd ask also your take on that, which, you know, of course, you know, again, any thoughts on the question around kind of boards and such also relevant, but wondered whether we could hear from you a little on that side of things.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the point was made that in automotive and the wider manufacturing industries and in professional services, frankly, there's a long way to go in terms of gender balance, and I think that's where certainly people are starting with gender balance, but clearly there's a whole raft of other dimensions of inclusivity and inclusion and diversity that we need to think about. But I mean, and for automotive, there's great initiatives like there's the Automotive 30% Club and also Deloitte's own Women at the Wheel, which are really about sort of striving to make a difference and demonstrating that gender balance in leadership teams and in leadership actually leads to more more successful businesses, and that's that's proven through the data. Our Women at the Wheel is, I'm not sure consortium is the right word, but it's a sort of community of a support network, if you like, for developing women who want to be the next generation of leaders in the automotive business. That was founded by my friend and colleague Sarah Noble, and it's been really, really successful actually in terms of kind of creating a great community, lots of events, lots of kind of training support, professional development opportunities, and we're very, very proud of that and proud of the work that Sarah and the wider team have done in that. And I think any of those initiatives can be really valuable and play a role, but you'd almost like to get to the point where you don't need them, because it's so much, they're almost tactics, because we need to force an issue and challenge some unconscious biases, but you'd like to be at the point where these things are so ingrained into the fabric of our culture and decision making across these industries that you don't need these specific actions to be in place. And we'd like to get there, but I think there is a long way to go.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and you say that, woven into the fabric, that that is the dream, that this is woven into the fabric, the makeup of all of our organisations and all of our boards. But indeed, there's a long way to go. But having it all together, I think it's very positive. I think leaders are more willing to not only be vulnerable, but also to actually speak out about this. And we need champions and allies who are willing and able to do this. Now, I'm conscious of timing, so I'm going to ask you all a question each. Actually, a number of them you have answered. We had quite a few questions come in today with this panel happening, which is great. A lot have been answered, so I'm going to ask you all very, very quickly one final question each before we summarise. First, Andy, I'm coming to you again, so I keep picking on you today, so sorry for that. But the question is, you've worked as a very successful CEO clearly throughout your career, a number of different organisations. How difficult did you find the transition into a chairman role, which arguably is less hands-on than the classic C-suite roles that you've had in the past?
You have to be prepared for the change, because you're at the side of the pitch, you're not on the pitch now. But being on the side of the pitch means that you do get the opportunity to make sure that the strategy is agreed, and then you performance manage against the strategy. But in doing that, you are part of creating the culture of openness, transparency and trust. And if you do that, and I think if you put the customer in the middle of this, which is critically important, then you've got the key ingredients, some of the key ingredients of success. And I guess fundamentally, you're then surrounding yourself with extremely talented people, all of whom have got a huge part to contribute. But I think you have to go through a mindset change, because you're suddenly not in central midfield or the principal striker. You are on the side of the pitch, and you've got a significant role to play, but you can't kick the ball anymore. Be prepared for that, really.
That's a great analogy. I love the sporting analogies, because it just puts that picture straight into people's minds, doesn't it? I can see everyone kind of smiling and nodding as you're talking here. And Katherine, I had quite a lot of questions for you, which, quite classic questions, actually, which I hear from many female leaders and other diverse leaders within, and men as well, but a few questions, quite a lot of questions actually, around being a female leader and ultimately the most senior female in your organisation. What were some of the biggest challenges that you had? And in a more broad brush way as well, I was asked a question about the D&I influences that you have learned from the consortium of countries that you're involved with.
I think the advice I'd give was somebody for either gender. Speak up for yourself. I learned very early on, working in automotive, to use humour. If you see inappropriate behaviour, you can often deal with it with humour. If you're confident enough. I know it's not always easy. And also for me, I had some people who really, and I use this word, if you'll forgive me, because we make wings here in the UK, who were the wind beneath my wings. They really, really encouraged me, say, come on, Katherine, you can do this. And I think it's, really important for us to do the same for other people, and do a lot of, I know it's easy to say, do a lot of mentoring, and it doesn't have to take a long time. Just ask people how they're getting on with their career, and, do they need any help and advice. I think that's a key thing for me. I wouldn't want to work in a company that doesn't care about D&I. There's always improvements that can be made in any companies I've had dealings with. I saw some inappropriate behaviours when I first worked in automotive, for example, at some of the motor shows. and I still saw it at some of the air shows. And you have to speak up, but I just think there's a lot of people it's not an issue anymore. My nephew, who's studying at Exeter University, said to me the other day, Auntie Katherine, why are you going on so much about gender diversity? It's for him, everyone is equal, and he sees his mother have a good career, and he's got a lot of friends who, clearly ambitious, so professionally. So I've got a great faith in the next generation, and a lot of the women's activities I'm involved in, we have lots and lots of younger male colleagues who actually really help us with the programme. So that gives me great heart for the next generation.
That's really great to hear, and I agree. Every generation seems to have very different takes on the world of work, and if I look more holistically at what D&I looks like, and not just gender, all the other things we mentioned as well before, of which many of them are invisible, is ultimately there's probably going to be subsectors almost even of diversities. There's lots and lots of language, and I think sometimes people are actually scared of being vilified by saying the wrong thing because there's some new lingo when it comes to gender or being gender neutral or whatever that might be, and so it'll be interesting to see how it does play out. Andrew, a question for you. You mentioned earlier about sending everyone home, and obviously being able to adapt very quickly and nimbly, which is brilliant, to the home working. Do you see that as a future for Alpha within the business, and what are your thoughts on the future now of flexible working within the industry, wider industry that you're working in?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, because it was the idea of remote working was already a bit of a trend anyway. I think Nick made the point. If you're involved in professional services, then on any given day, the most disappointing thing I can see is the implementation part of the team at their desks, because they should be doing stuff with customers, but that's an expensive thing to do, and therefore this kind of collaboration was starting to take hold. In terms of what this truly means for empirically, it's really difficult to call, and we've already talked about it in our industry a little bit. That on one level, we could look at you often measure development teams in terms of their velocity. What's happened with the velocity of the development group as it started to work from home? But as Andy reminded us, there's homeschooling, there's kids sucking bandwidth, and actually it's a slightly imperfect home working environment to measure. I think what it does tell us is that it definitely works to an extent. I think as an organization that has to bring in new talent, and all of these Gen Xers and millennials that we've talked about, who are somewhat differently wired and somewhat demanding in terms of the values and the inclusion practices that we've been talking about, something that they expect anyway. I guess the other point is about leading from the front, and I don't think that's changed either. I think one thing that this has reminded me of, actually, it's a good and productive thing to do, to work from home, to be with my dog and to get a little bit more headspace. And I shouldn't be afraid to admit, as I did on Monday, that actually I was a little bit low at the weekend, and I think all of that stuff is part of leadership. So I think things will change. Myself, I don't think there'll be a radical shift as a result of COVID, but I think it's a shift that was already taking place. Layla?
Thanks so much for sharing that, Andrew. And in specific, the not feeling great at the weekend, I think, one thing we perhaps haven't touched on so much today is vulnerability. Everyone is in this kind of big, gigantic boat fighting this invisible enemy. And I think, if there's one thing that I've learned, or at least found most inspirational when I'm interviewing business leaders, is those that have the courage to demonstrate vulnerability. It's something which I think actually takes a huge amount more courage than any of us would like to believe. And in specific for CEOs, chairs, board level individuals, even harder, arguably, because actually, you have the building pressure, insurmountable pressure often, especially given the circumstances, from teams and people wanting reassurance, people wanting an arm around them to say everything's going to be okay. Actually, we must put our own air mask on before we put everyone else's on, as they say in the airlines, to make sure that we look after ourselves. So thank you, Andrew, on that note. And finally, Nick, just before we summarise, a question for yourself. Quite a few other consultancy type questions actually, but I'll just ask you one: is where will diversity, inclusion, and belonging sit in terms of a priority for Deloitte and for your clients? I know it is something that is, of course, important to the organisation.
Well, and for us, it's absolutely board level priority and a key part. We talked a lot about purpose and values, and absolutely front and centre of that, and that won't change. And I think, as we've talked about today, the current situation has really magnified some of those factors. I think actually we've talked a lot about remote working. I think we're certainly seeing some of maybe the biases or perceptions around flexible working from home starting to dissolve in this period, and maybe in the long term there's a positive in that, where possibly people who have required that greater flexibility or of where they work and how they work and when and working from home is, and possibly there's been some perceptions around that, and I think we're breaking that down, and that should allow greater opportunity for people who have requirements that demand that. So absolutely, front and centre for us, and I really hope the current situation can force the issue even further.
Thank you ever so much indeed. And because we're out of time, I'm going to do a very brief summary, but thank you, each and every one of you. You've been absolutely fantastic today, and it's been really insightful hearing from all of your perspectives, not only from the differences in terms of the sectors, but also what we're experiencing and how you're all feeling personally, most importantly. But by way of summary, I think, what we've all kind of said here is we can see the demonstration of the extent of connections induced by globalization. I definitely do believe, as I'm sure you all do, that an open world can generate more knowledge, sharing, and certainly innovation. We've seen huge, seismic shift in terms of technology and changes. I mentioned Darwinism earlier. I think this is an evolution like one that we are unlikely to see again in our lifetimes, I should think. But when we strip it down to those core values and what this means to each and every one of us at this point in time, it certainly has demonstrated that those things that are important, the people are important, values and businesses that care, one hopes will absolutely come to the forefront, and can see clearly that all of you are doing your absolute best, battling through headwinds to make sure that people, empathy, vulnerability, and also being as honest as you possibly can given the current circumstances, it is absolutely at the forefront. Finally, I think what was really nice to see from all of you is the level of emotional intelligence, which I think is going to be an absolutely critical piece of leaders for future generations of leaders. Arguably right now this is a time where business success is very much based on intelligence, perhaps formatively about being who could be the most bolshy perhaps and kind of profit centered. Now it's about kind of information and intelligence, but I think in the future, without sounding too cheesy here, I do think it's very much going to be about the heart and about emotional intelligence. It's one thing that you can't recreate right now when it comes to digital technology. And so really being authentic, as you all have been, I think has just been really remarkable to see, and very much enjoyed having you all here today on the panel. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Layla Mackenzie-Dallas, and you've been listening to the Dial Global Virtual Lounge. We had some fantastic panelists today. If you would like to catch up on demand at any point, you can do. We have a COVID-19 support hub, which is entirely free to you and those within your organisation. Visit www.dialglobal.org, where we are giving away free memberships, and you can check out, of course, all of the key points from today's panel. So if you missed anything, you didn't write anything down, don't worry at all. It will all be there for you, along with details of everyone who was a participant and their respective organisations. Thank you very much.